They are the police, but act like armed bullies with power. In a wealthy neighborhood, they handcuffed and humiliated a black girl just because she didn't match the right skin color. They thought she would remain silent. They didn't know she was the daughter of the U.S. Attorney General. And with just one phone call, the young girl triggered a storm that would uproot an entire system of corruption. At the heart of a large city, Precinct 18 stood as a symbol of corruption and abuse of power. For over 2 decades, the police there had turned the law into their own game, using their power to manipulate justice, twist the truth, and exploit their positions for personal gain. These uniformed officers who were supposed to protect justice were in fact the ones spreading fear, injustice, and oppression, especially towards the black community. Precinct 18 didn't operate alone. It received support and cover from powerful officials such as judges, lawyers, and even local politicians. That power created an almost impenetrable fortress, an underground network with the belief that no one could bring them down. Amidst this dark backdrop, Emily Davis emerged as a bright, contrasting figure. Emily was a 17-year-old girl with smooth, dark skin and sharp, intelligent eyes that always sparkled with a strong belief in justice and equality. Born into a special family, her father, Malcolm Davis, was the U.S. Attorney General, a man who always stood at the front lines in the fight against corruption and injustice. Inheriting her father's brave spirit and high ideals, Emily had stood out not just for her excellent academic achievements but also for her strong, upright character, refusing to bow to any form of injustice. However, one late afternoon, Emily's peaceful life suddenly took a sharp turn. The young girl innocently walked into Thompson's Market, a high-end store located in the wealthy Oakwood Heights neighborhood, where most of the residents were white. Suspicious glances and covert stares were directed at Emily just because her presence stood out among the other customers. Emily was used to such looks, but this time the gaze felt more sinister. At the entrance of the store stood 2 police officers, Brad Mitchell, with a muscular build, a cold face, and icy blue eyes, and Kyle Harass, younger but with an ambition to gain the recognition of his colleagues at any cost. Seeing Emily carefully picking out fruits, Mitchell whispered to his colleague in a voice full of contempt and malice, "Look at her, she doesn't belong here." Without wasting time, the 2 officers approached Emily, deliberately making heavy footsteps to create pressure and fear for the young girl. Emily could clearly sense the hostility directed at her. Mitchell spoke in a dangerous but fake tone. "Young lady, we've received some complaints about suspicious behavior here." Calmly, Emily placed the fruit bag down and tried to maintain her confidence. "Officers, I'm just shopping. I've lived in this city since I was a child and I haven't done anything wrong." Harris sneered, his voice laced with insinuation. "Do you come to this store often? A person like you?" The young girl responded calmly but firmly. "I have the right to go wherever I want and buy whatever I need." At that moment, the store manager approached, his eyes nervously shifting between Emily and the 2 officers. Quickly choosing sides, he said, "She's been hanging around here for a while, and customers are starting to get uncomfortable." He lied blatantly, though Emily had only just entered the store less than 10 minutes ago. Emily immediately protested, showing her parking ticket and the time on her phone as proof, but Mitchell didn't even glance at it. He stepped closer, his voice cold. "Show me your ID now." As Emily reached into her bag to get her ID, Mitchell suddenly grabbed her wrist, so forcefully that it caused her to stumble and crash into the fruit stand, sending oranges scattering across the floor. "Don't resist!" Mitchell shouted, even though Emily had shown no signs of resistance. The young girl was quickly handcuffed by Harris, the cold steel cuffs tightening around her wrists. The terrifying scene unfolded before many people in the store, but they all chose to look away, pretending not to see. Only Jordan Carter, A black boy the same age as Emily was brave enough to pull out his phone and record the injustice. Mitchell immediately noticed and rushed to threaten him, forcing Jordan to delete the precious video. Stunned, but still holding on to her dignity, Emily was led away amidst the curious and prejudiced stares of the crowd. Little did she know this wrongful event would turn her into the most vivid witness, someone who would expose the deep-seated corruption, injustice, and racism at the heart of Precinct 18, something that everyone, including her father, U.S. Attorney General Malcolm Davis, had long wanted to reveal but had been unable to find solid evidence. From that moment, the story of Emily Davis and her brave struggle against a corrupt, unjust, and racist power system began. And Precinct 18, an apparently impenetrable fortress, had made the biggest mistake in its history, underestimating the courage, intelligence, and resilience of a 17-year-old black girl. A great storm was about to break, and they had no idea that they had lit the spark. The cold, harsh lights in Thompson's Market cast long shadows on the polished tile floor, reflecting the distorted image of Emily being escorted by 2 officers. The store, once a quiet and luxurious space, was now filled with the tense curiosity of the wealthy customers. Their eyes, both intrigued and indifferent, followed Emily as though she were already guilty, despite no one knowing the truth behind the baseless accusations thrown at her by the officers. Brad Mitchell, the officer with a cold face and piercing green eyes, tightened his grip on Emily's arm as if to assert his absolute power. He turned to the store manager with a dramatic expression. "We'll handle this quickly, Mr. Parker. Thank you for the report." Thomas Parker, the manager, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit and polished leather shoes, nodded hastily, but his averted gaze revealed a subtle unease, as though he had just aided in an action that wasn't entirely right. In Parker's eyes, the tranquility of the store mattered more than protecting an unknown black girl who didn't belong to the elite world around them. Emily tried to keep calm, her voice shaking yet resolute. "I didn't steal anything. I can prove it. You're making a huge mistake." Kyle Harris, the younger, more ambitious officer, merely smirked, leaning in to whisper mockingly in Emily's ear. "Shut up, girl. People like you always claim innocence, but the security cameras will tell a different story." Emily felt her heart race, a mix of anger and humiliation swelling inside her. She knew very well that there were no cameras capturing any theft, but she also understood that no one here truly cared about the truth. From just a few steps away, Jordan Carter, a black student the same age as Emily, quietly observed from the checkout counter. Jordan had witnessed many similar unjust situations, but this time the composure and dignity of the girl made him decide to act. He quietly pulled his phone from his pocket, raised it, and carefully recorded the entire scene unfolding before him. However, Mitchell quickly noticed Jordan's actions. He suddenly released Emily, striding toward the young man with an unmistakable threat in his steps. Jordan quickly tried to hide his phone, but it was too late. Mitchell grabbed his wrist with a force that made Jordan wince in pain, causing the phone to fall to the floor. "What do you think you're doing, kid?" Mitchell growled, his eyes gleaming with an unmistakable danger. "You want to join her in a cell tonight." Jordan, though frightened, remained calm and responded as steadily as he could. "I know my rights. I'm allowed to record this." Mitchell sneered derisively, leaning in close to Jordan so that only he could hear. He whispered, the words sharp and threatening. "At Precinct 18, your rights are whatever we say they are. Delete that video right now or I guarantee you'll never walk freely on the street again." In that tense moment, Jordan glanced at Emily. Their eyes met, sharing a mutual understanding of the helplessness in the face of such overwhelming power. Despite the rage boiling inside him, Jordan knew that fighting back now would only make things worse for both of them. Trembling, he bent down to pick up the phone and deleted the video under Mitchell's watchful eye. Emily stood frozen, her heart tightening in helplessness as she watched the only person who dared speak up for her be subdued. She could clearly sense that this wasn't the first time these officers had behaved like this. Their chilling confidence and the way they easily manipulated both the store manager and the crowd proved that these types of incidents had happened before. Once Mitchell was satisfied watching the last piece of evidence disappear, he turned and ordered Harass to take Emily out of the store. As she was dragged outside, a wave of shame and injustice consumed her. The cold stares of the crowd followed her, as though she had been sentenced right there in this humiliating moment. Outside, beneath the dimming light of the setting sun on the sidewalk, Emily suddenly noticed that the cameras on the officers' body cams had been turned off. She realized that she was stepping into a far more dangerous battle than she had ever imagined. Precinct 18 thought arresting Emily would be a simple matter, easily forgotten like the hundreds of wrongful arrests they had made before. But this time, they didn't know that they had just picked a fight with someone not only armed with intelligence and courage, but also with a power they couldn't foresee. Emily's father, Malcolm Davis, the man who led the Department of Justice and would do anything to protect justice and his most beloved family member. As the evening fell and the darkness slowly crept over the city, the events that transpired at Thompson's Market marked the quiet beginning of an intense confrontation between power and truth, between justice and injustice. Emily Davis would hold the key to determining the outcome. The police car rolled slowly through the familiar streets, as if intentionally prolonging the time to increase the pressure on Emily's mind. From the rear window of the car, Emily watched the scenery outside gradually fade into the night. The upscale houses with warm lights passed by quickly, giving way to the dark, cold row of buildings housing Precinct 18, the area known more for its scandals than for protection and justice. When the car door opened in front of the old building, the chaotic noise from inside spilled out like a warning. Officers Mitchell and Harass escorted Emily through a hallway, where pieces of peeling paint and flickering lights from old fluorescent bulbs created an unsettling atmosphere. Precinct 18 was unlike any police station Emily had ever imagined. Instead of order and discipline, she could clearly feel the suffocating air, hiding many dark secrets. Brad Mitchell yanked Emily in front of an old wooden desk and pushed her into a chair roughly. His eyes gleamed with satisfaction, as if capturing and overpowering the weak was a pleasure that made him feel powerful. Mitchell leaned down and looked directly into Emily's eyes with a mocking smile. "Sit still and don't cause any more trouble, kid. It's best if you just admit to your mistakes and make things easier for both of us." Emily didn't respond. She stared at Mitchell with quiet determination, her gaze sharp enough to make him hesitate for a moment. But Mitchell only sneered and turned to walk away, clearly thinking that Emily was just a helpless girl who couldn't do anything to affect him or anyone else at Precinct 18. Left alone in the dim corner of the shared office, Emily quickly realized that the officers around her were far too familiar with wrongdoing. She noticed a middle-aged female officer with a name tag that read Turner, working on a computer, repeatedly deleting footage from the security cameras and adjusting timestamps in the event log, as if this had become a daily routine. Turner worked with a chilling ease, even sipping her coffee as she absent-mindedly deleted important video footage. Further off, young Officer Kyle Harass was carefully editing Emily's arrest report, deliberately adding fake details to transform her from an innocent student into a reckless, aggressive suspect. Beside Harass, Brad Mitchell was speaking quietly on the phone, but his words were loud enough for Emily to hear. "Yes, sir, Callahan. Yes, we'll handle this one neatly. No trouble for Mayor Kensington or Judge Whittaker. Emily flinched at the mention of those prominent names. She realized that this wasn't just about racial discrimination or wrongful arrest. It was part of a whole system of power being shielded by the highest authorities in the city. This made her even more aware of the danger she was facing. A little later, Chief of Police Callahan appeared, wearing a crisp uniform and carefully combed gray hair. He walked over to Mitchell and Harass with a serious look, but his voice was full of protection. "Do it like you always do, Mitchell. I don't want any trouble this time, especially with that girl's father. Make sure everything is covered up perfectly and the records are clean when they reach Judge Whittaker." "Yes, boss," Mitchell responded quickly, his tone carrying a rare respect. Emily quietly continued observing and remembering every detail, from the small conversations, the ways evidence was fabricated, to the exchange of knowing glances between the officers and their superiors. Though she appeared to be just an ignored student, Emily had been taught by her father, Malcolm Davis, the U.S. Attorney General, how to recognize signs of corruption in power. She understood that staying silent and observing was the best strategy to expose the entire web of corruption. By late at night, Emily was still kept in the corner of the room, but she didn't miss any developments. She saw Judge Whittaker visit the police station, hurriedly entering Callahan's office, and after a private conversation they both laughed loudly, as if they had agreed on something important. Not long after, Mayor Kensington appeared, accompanied by his personal secretary, walking into Callahan's office with a serious expression. The meeting was brief, but long enough for Emily to understand that all the most powerful people were concerned about her father intervening and complicating their plans. As dawn began to break outside the window, Emily realized that she had witnessed enough evidence to uncover the dark truth about Precinct 18 and the powerful figures behind it. Those who thought she was just a weak, harmless girl had unwittingly provided her with all the sharpest weapons, the truths they could never deny. Sitting there silently, her eyes filled with fierce determination, Emily waited for the right moment to contact her father. She knew that the corrupt officials had made the gravest mistake by underestimating a smart, brave, and justice-seeking high school girl. From their disdain, a great storm would rise, sweeping away all the lies, injustice, and corruption of Precinct 18 into the light. The first light of dawn slowly seeped through the dust-covered window cracks, dispelling a portion of the oppressive darkness in Precinct 18. Emily, sitting quietly in the corner of the room, felt her body weary, yet her mind was sharp, taut with focus. For hours, she had witnessed every form of corruption and abuse of power unfold right before her eyes, with no one in the room thinking she could remember or even understand the true meaning behind it all. It was this arrogance and overconfidence that Emily was determined to exploit in her pursuit of justice. As the officers switched shifts in the morning, Emily spotted a rare opening. The officer on duty monitoring her stepped outside to take a phone call, leaving the desk phone unattended. Her heart began to race. She knew this was a rare, perhaps the only, opportunity to contact her father. Wasting no time, she stood up quickly, approached the desk, and silently picked up the receiver, dialing the familiar number of Malcolm Davis, her father, always ready to protect her and believe in her. After 2 short but seemingly endless rings, her father's deep, concerned voice came through the line. "Emily, where are you? I've been looking for you all night." Emily quickly kept her voice low and clear, whispering fast but decisively. "Dad, I'm at Precinct 18, and you need to listen carefully. The cops here have set me up and accused me of stealing with no evidence. But more importantly, I've seen them falsify evidence, erase surveillance footage, and cover up a lot of criminal activity. Chief Callahan, Judge Whittaker, even Mayor Kensington are all involved. They think no one will dare to stand against them." A brief silence followed, and Emily could almost feel her father holding back his fury and emotion. "Are you sure, Emily? Is everything you've said true?" Emily replied firmly, her voice full of unwavering conviction. "I'm sure. I saw and heard every detail clearly. They didn't know who I was, so they spoke freely right in front of me. You need to act fast, because they'll soon realize I know too much." At that moment, she heard footsteps approaching. Emily quickly hung up the phone and returned to her seat, pretending she had never left. The person who appeared at the door was a female officer with neatly tied hair, a stern expression, but her eyes held a gentleness unlike any of the other colleagues Emily had encountered. It was Lisa Carter, a detective who had served many years at Precinct 18, known for her honesty and principles, but recently she had begun to suspect the shady dealings taking place within her own department. Lisa walked over, her eyes watching Emily with care and subtle concern, as though wondering how such a young girl could find herself in such a dire situation. "Are you all right, kid?" Lisa asked gently, her voice warm, almost as if trying to comfort Emily. Emily nodded faintly, but her eyes betrayed her unease. Lisa scanned the room briefly before lowering her voice. "I've heard a few things. Do you need help?" Emily looked deep into Lisa's eyes, trying to sense her sincerity and trustworthiness before deciding to share something important. "I'm innocent, but they framed me. I've heard a lot of things here, things I wasn't supposed to hear. I'm afraid they won't let me leave here easily. My father, he'll come, but I need someone here on my side." Lisa hesitated for a moment, fully aware of the dangers of getting involved in such internal matters. But when she saw the resolve in Emily's eyes, she realized she could no longer turn a blind eye to the wrongdoings she had begun to question for some time. "Emily, trust me," Lisa said softly, yet with determination. "I will do everything I can to protect you and bring the truth to light." A surge of hope flooded through Emily as she realized that from this moment on, she was no longer alone in her fight against the dark network of power in Precinct 18. Lisa turned to leave, but before stepping out of the room, she discreetly placed a small phone next to Emily, her eyes conveying a clear message. "Keep it safe. I'll always be watching over you." As Lisa walked away, Emily quickly slipped the phone into her pocket. Now, she had an important ally from within, someone who could help her expose the truth she had risked her own safety to witness. Deep inside, Emily silently thanked fate for sending Lisa Carter at the exact moment she needed help the most. Outside the window, dawn had completely dispelled the darkness, but for Precinct 18, the real darkness was only just beginning to reveal itself. A storm named Justice had officially been set in motion by Emily Davis's fateful call, and this time, no shield would be strong enough to stop the wrath of Malcolm Davis and the power of the truth his daughter had just handed to him. The phone had barely been set down by Emily for a minute when, in the Department of Justice office, Malcolm Davis immediately sprang from his familiar office chair, feeling as though every second ticking by was too precious to waste. A man who had faced numerous powerful forces in his career, Malcolm had never felt the weight of pressure as he did in that moment, knowing that his own daughter was in the midst of danger, at the mercy of people who would stop at nothing to manipulate the law for personal gain. With a determined expression, he quickly called Sarah Williams, his trusted chief of staff, instructing her to assemble a special investigation team. His voice was clear, but laced with a particular tension. "Sarah, get our best team together immediately. I need all the files, history of operations, and any prior allegations linked to Precinct 18. This is a top priority. absolute confidentiality. Sarah looked at Malcolm, momentarily surprised, but quickly nodded, fully aware this was no ordinary case. The sharpness in his eyes and the commanding tone of his voice told her that Precinct 18 was about to face a battle they never saw coming. Soon, the office buzzed with an unusual flurry of activity. Federal investigators, legal experts, and data analysts took their places, working tirelessly to find any scrap of evidence. The large screen in the conference room flickered to life, displaying the powerful faces involved. Police Chief Callahan, Judge Whitaker, and Mayor Kensington, figures who once seemed untouchable, now at the center of a covert investigation. While Malcolm began mobilizing his forces, far from the Department of Justice office, Detective Lisa Carter was silently taking her own decisive steps. After a brief conversation with Emily, Lisa could no longer ignore the truth she had suspected for a long time. For years, she had believed in the ideal of justice, but the very colleagues she trusted most had shaken that belief to its core. After hours, Lisa carefully observed her surroundings before quickly leaving Precinct 18, holding a small USB drive containing the most crucial evidence she had secretly gathered. Deleted security camera footage, recorded conversations between Callahan and Whitaker, and forged documents created by Mitchell and Harass. All of it was safely in Lisa's hands, ready to expose the rot within a system that seemed invulnerable. With the utmost caution, Lisa chose a small cafe in the suburbs, a place she knew no one would recognize her. She opened her laptop, connected to a secure encrypted network, and swiftly sent all the valuable data directly to Malcolm Davis's secret contact address she had previously uncovered. Before closing her laptop, Lisa added a short message, imbued with all the resolve and courage she wanted to convey. They think they can control everything. This is the truth. Please protect Emily. Just minutes later, an urgent message from the tech team echoed on Malcolm Davis's phone, notifying him that a special file had just been sent. Malcolm immediately opened the file in front of his special investigation team. The screen quickly displayed irrefutable evidence, videos of fabricated arrests, power-laden but immoral conversations between Callahan, Whitaker, and Mayor Kensington, false reports, and shockingly detailed forged documents. The room fell silent, the only sound the steady breathing of each person. Malcolm stared at the evidence on the screen with unwavering resolve, but also a deep, simmering anger. After a few seconds of silence, he turned to the lead investigator, his voice firm and authoritative. "We have everything we need. It's time to act, get all the necessary paperwork to request search and arrest warrants. I want Precinct 18 to have no chance to react." Everyone immediately returned to work with greater speed and efficiency. Malcolm felt his strength renewed by the courage and resilience that both his daughter, Emily, and Lisa Carter had shown. He understood that it was their bravery that had given him the sharpest tools to take down this corrupt power network. Meanwhile, Lisa left the cafe, feeling a mix of relief and nervous anticipation, fully aware that from this moment on, she would have to stay vigilant. But deep down, Lisa felt a sense of pride, knowing she had finally made the right decision, standing with the light rather than bowing to the darkness. At Precinct 18, the powerful figures were still confident that their secrets were safely guarded, unaware that in the shadows, a storm named Malcolm Davis was quietly but decisively drawing near, stronger and more determined than ever before. This time, all those who had abused their power would soon realize that the truth they had worked so hard to conceal for years would become the strongest weapon against them. While Precinct 18 was still deeply immersed in complacency, firmly believing that no force would dare challenge their power, A meticulously calculated and flawless plan was silently unfolding in the Department of Justice office. Malcolm Davis, with a sharp, unwavering gaze, watched the special investigative team complete their final preparations. When the clock on the wall struck 8 a.m., Malcolm stood up and issued a decisive command. "Deploy immediately. We can't let them have more time to erase the evidence." Just minutes later, a convoy of black vehicles with federal insignia quietly but swiftly began to roll toward Precinct 18. The thorough preparations ensured they encountered no obstacles. Not even the police officers standing guard outside the precinct gate had time to notice anything unusual before it was too late. At Precinct 18, Sheriff Callahan had just entered his office, still unaware of the storm approaching, when the door was suddenly slammed open. Standing before him were dozens of federal agents in neatly pressed uniforms, holding search and arrest warrants signed by a federal court. Callahan froze for a moment. His face, which usually exuded arrogance, turned pale. His eyes filled with a mix of panic and rage. "What is this? What do you think you're doing?" Callahan shouted, but his voice held no authority anymore. One of the federal agents stepped forward, his voice cold, but carrying the undeniable strength of justice. "Sheriff Callahan, you are under arrest for charges of corruption, abuse of power, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to conceal crimes. Anything you say from now on will be recorded and used in court." In the hallway outside, Mitchell and Harass were quickly subdued while still stunned, unable to believe what was happening. Harass panicked, seeking help from colleagues around him, but no one dared to step forward. They all quietly lowered their heads, avoiding eye contact, as if they understood that the era of Precinct 18's rule by fear had come to an end. In the holding cell, Emily could hear the loud noises outside and immediately understood what was happening. Her heart raced, but not out of fear. It was a feeling of relief and a strong belief that her father had arrived just as he had always promised her. When the door to the room swung open, Emily saw a female agent with a warm, reassuring look. The agent quickly came over, unlocked the cuffs, and gently helped her stand up. "Emily Davis, right? We've been instructed to take you out of here safely." Emily smiled with relief and walked out with confidence, as if all the emotional scars she had endured during her time in captivity vanished in that very moment. Walking down the hall of Precinct 18, Emily witnessed a scene she once thought would never happen. The once arrogant, pompous officers now stood still, their eyes avoiding her, filled with fear as she passed by. Mitchell and Harass, handcuffed and escorted by federal agents, glared at Emily with hatred and helplessness, unable to believe that the one who brought them down was just a small, 17-year-old girl. Before stepping out the door, Emily caught the gaze of Lisa Carter, a detective standing in a discreet corner, quietly observing everything. Lisa nodded slightly at Emily, a gesture simple but full of meaning. Emily knew that Lisa had been the one to silently help her, and she couldn't help but feel deeply grateful for the courage the detective had shown. Stepping out of Precinct 18, Emily took a deep breath, feeling the warm morning sunlight on her face, completely dispelling the darkness she had just endured. Her father, Malcolm Davis, was waiting for her next to a black car, his face showing pride and relief as he saw his daughter safely step out. Malcolm quickly walked over, embraced Emily tightly, and whispered in a loving yet firm voice, "I told you, my daughter. I will never let anyone hurt you without paying the price." Emily looked up at her father, her eyes filled with strength and confidence. "I knew you would come, and I also know that everything will change from now on. We won't let anyone abuse power like that anymore." Father and daughter got into the waiting car, leaving Precinct 18 behind, now a symbol of a crumbling and fallen power. The once powerful figures, who had thought themselves untouchable, now faced justice, something they had once scorned and distorted. The raid on Precinct 18 was not just a victory for Emily and Malcolm, but a victory for all those who had been threatened and oppressed by that dark force. And now, with the light of justice rekindled, none of them could hide the truth any longer. When the doors of Precinct 18 closed behind Emily Davis and the vehicle carrying her left the scene, the shockwave caused by the Department of Justice's raid showed no sign of subsiding. In fact, it began to spread and reach higher levels of power, where those who had long considered themselves above the law resided. Malcolm Davis did not stop at dismantling a corrupt police precinct. He understood that in order to root out this festering sore, one had to trace the muddy strings of power that supported it from behind. And those strings, no one else but the two names Emily mentioned in the fateful phone call held them: Mayor James Kensington and Judge William Whitaker, two of the most powerful figures in the city, who still appeared before the public with a polished demeanor and slogans of order, justice, and prosperity, while behind the scenes, they headed a network that manipulated the justice system, oppressed the vulnerable, and pocketed millions of taxpayer dollars. For the 48 hours following the raid on Precinct 18, Malcolm's federal investigation team worked relentlessly. The documents provided by Lisa Carter, combined with the data system seized from the precinct's servers, gradually revealed a bigger picture, a web of overlapping powers, each link held by money, threats, and deliberate silence. A copy of a ledger from an offshore account discovered in a deleted file, still saved on a backup hard drive, showed that every time Whitaker dismissed a lawsuit involving Precinct 18 officers, a 5- or 6-figure sum was transferred to an account registered to a shell company in the Cayman Islands, a company officially owned by Whitaker's ex-wife, but entirely run by him in the shadows. Mayor Kensington, who had once collaborated with Callahan at private parties, was also found to have received dozens of urban development fees from businesses connected to the police in exchange for protection and preferential licensing. When this information was officially released to the press by Malcolm, public outrage erupted like a fire catching on a dry field. Thousands flooded into the central city squares, holding banners demanding justice, judicial reform, and the prosecution of those who had exploited their power for profit at the expense of the pain and fear of the community. A judge cannot wield the scales of justice and take bribes. A female student's statement during a protest at Freedom Square was quoted in major newspapers. "Our mayor doesn't protect the people. He sells them out every day." A large sign was held high amidst the crowd, with chants echoing through the streets. Under immense public pressure and with irrefutable evidence, emergency arrest warrants were signed for both James Kensington and William Whitaker. In a symbolic moment, local television broadcasted live the scene of the two powerful men being escorted out of City Hall and the city's Supreme Court, places where they had once entered as those who determined the fates of others, now leaving with their hands cuffed, heads bowed low under the flashing lights of the media. Kensington still tried to maintain his calm demeanor, but his face turned pale when reporters pressed him about the funds flowing into offshore accounts registered to his family members. Whitaker tried to avoid the cameras, hurriedly walking away as if he wanted to escape the humiliation he never thought he would face during his lifelong career as a judge. On social media, millions shared the video of Emily Davis leaving Precinct 18 under the respect of federal agents, becoming a living symbol of the belief that justice, though slow, could still prevail. And in every comment, every call for reform, the name Emily Davis was mentioned as the spark of a political earthquake no one expected to be ignited by a 17-year-old girl. Malcolm Davis did not step forward before the media as a savior. He quietly worked in his office, but inside he understood that this battle had entered a new phase. If Precinct 18 was a malignant tumor, then Kensington and Whitaker were the blood vessels that had sustained it for 2 decades. And now, with those blood vessels severed, the entire old power structure stood on the brink of collapse. The fight was far from over, but the public had awakened. Those who had once been silent out of fear began to speak up. Those who had once bowed their heads were now lifting them, stepping out into the streets, and in all those people, everyone understood that the truth had just reclaimed its place, and no one would be able to easily push it back into the depths of darkness again. The aftershocks from the high-profile arrests still reverberated through the corridors of power and in the hearts of the people. As protest banners remained draped across public squares, and the chant of "Justice for All" echoed through the streets elsewhere, in a secure cell at a federal detention facility, one man quietly plotted to turn the tide. Former Police Chief Robert Callahan, once the holder of absolute power at Precinct 18, would not accept defeat so easily. Deprived of his badge and title, Callahan no longer issued orders, but he still had something he believed could buy his freedom back: the network of loyalty from his golden days. Those who hadn't been investigated or simply hadn't been caught. And, more importantly, he knew exactly who were the 2 names that were causing the system he built to slowly crumble. Detective Lisa Carter, who had bravely broken the silence of many years, and the student Jordan Carter, who had the courage not to erase the original video, the one that carried the voice of thousands who had been silenced. Somehow, a short note, just a few scribbled lines, made its way out of Callahan's cell. Through a corrupted guard, it reached a group of former officers, willing to do anything to protect what remained of the old order. The order was simple, but cold. Clean up Carter and the kid. Leave no trace. Meanwhile, Lisa Carter remained under secret protection after handing over the evidence, though she had no idea she was being watched. One gloomy afternoon, after a meeting with the Department of Justice's investigative team, Lisa returned to her temporary apartment to find the front door showing signs of tampering. Instinctively, she drew her gun and backed away, relying on the years of training she'd received as an officer, unaware that a federal protection detail had already picked up the threat from a surveillance system installed around her home. In an instant, a rapid response team closed in on the area. 2 intruders, armed with suppressor-equipped firearms and dressed in all black, had already set an electrical trap in the kitchen and a tracking device in the bedroom. But before they could act, the door burst open with a loud shout. "Federal agents, drop your weapons." Gunfire erupted for a few brief seconds, ending as quickly as the brutal plan they had been given. Both intruders were subdued, their weapons confiscated, and their identities quickly determined. Both were former officers who had served under Callahan. Almost simultaneously, another serious situation unfolded in the building where Jordan Carter lived. After days of indirect threats via social media and anonymous messages, he was on his way to an interview with a major newspaper when an unmarked black SUV cut him off. 2 burly men stepped out, their eyes cold with intent to harm. But before they could act, a series of flashing car lights and blaring sirens tore through the tense air. Federal agents stormed in from 2 directions, subduing the thugs in mere seconds. Jordan was pulled out of the scene safely, his face pale, but his eyes still burning with resolve. Once again, his life was spared, not by luck, but by the vigilance Malcolm Davis had anticipated. Just hours later, a video surfaced on social media. The origin was unclear, but the footage showed Jordan Carter being beaten by 3 fully uniformed officers with batons and fists inside the detention facility just days prior. The camera angle was shaky, the lighting flickered, but the sound of batons striking flesh and the painful groans were unmistakable, leaving no room for anyone to deny it. One of the assailants was clearly visible. He was Harass, the officer who had arrested Emily at Thompson's Market. The video spread like wildfire. Hashtags such as Justice for Jordan, Break the Blue Wall, and Systemic Abuse flooded social media platforms. Protests, already frequent, now erupted into a frenzy. People carried images of Jordan with his bruised face, alongside signs demanding sweeping reforms in the police system. National media outlets began covering the story non-stop, and what was once considered a local scandal had now become a national conversation. Malcolm Davis stood in the Department of Justice office, gripping the phone as he received an update from the protection team assigned to Lisa and Jordan. He knew Callahan hadn't given up on his game, but he also realized something far more significant. These dirty acts of vengeance were the most vivid proof that the system had decayed to its core, and there was no choice but to tear it all down and rebuild from scratch. He looked out the window, where thousands of people were gathered under the drizzle, holding candles and banners demanding justice. His heart was heavy, but he wasn't afraid. This fight was no longer just about Emily, Lisa, or Jordan. It had become a symbol for a generation that refused to remain silent, that refused to back down, and that would not accept living under a system that protected power rather than people. And it was in these dark days, when violence tried to regain its footing, that the light of truth shone brightest. For once justice is awakened, no darkness can ever extinguish it. Under increasing pressure from public opinion and the intense scrutiny of the national media, the Department of Justice decided to hold public trials at the federal courthouse in downtown. The grand, historic building, once a symbol of justice, but in recent years had unknowingly shielded those who masked themselves in the law. Now, this place would become the arena for a historic confrontation between truth on one side and a decaying system of power that once confidently believed it would never be touched. The names of the 3 defendants were read aloud in the courtroom with such finality that the entire room fell silent. Former Police Chief Robert Callahan, former Mayor James Kensington, and former Judge William Whitaker, men who had once controlled the entire city from behind the scenes, now sat motionless in the dock, their eyes avoiding the gaze of the room, their forms withered like decaying monuments. Their lawyers, hired with the last of their frozen bank accounts, tried to delay the trial, citing procedural issues, health concerns, and political sensitivity. But the federal judge presiding over the case made a firm declaration. This is not just any trial. This is a trial of conscience, of responsibility, and of justice for all those who have been trampled by a corrupt power. On the very first day, the prosecutor presented an indictment that spanned over 300 pages, detailing each act of wrongdoing: bribery, falsification of evidence, witness intimidation, abuse of power, wrongful death of innocents, judicial collusion, and systemic assault. Each charge was like a knife piercing through the mask of morality that Callahan, Kensington, and Whitaker had worn for years. The first witness to take the stand was Detective Lisa Carter. In her neat black suit and calm demeanor, Lisa silenced the room as she began recounting her journey, from a loyal officer who trusted her organization to the day she realized she was living in a system run by fear and corruption. The evidence she submitted, audio recordings, videos, forged documents, was shown publicly, forcing both the jury and the public to confront the deeply ingrained corruption maintained by Precinct 18 and its high-ranking figures. But it was when Emily Davis took the witness stand that the courtroom truly fell into silence. The 17-year-old girl, who had once been scorned, handcuffed, and publicly humiliated simply for the color of her skin, now stood firm in the center of the room, her face calm, but her eyes burning with intensity. With an extraordinary memory and hours of practice with the prosecutors, Emily calmly presented every minute detail of her time in custody at Precinct 18. She remembered Callahan's voice on the phone when he ordered the cleaning up of all evidence, recalled Whitaker's calculating gaze when he discussed erasing all internal cameras to protect the officers. She described precisely the conversations between police officers, those seemingly innocent exchanges that concealed the entire map of dirty power behind each wrongful arrest, each doctored report, each name erased from the records. When Emily recounted the moment, she overheard a young officer say, "We'll do like we did with that old lady. Camera off, report clean, judge signs, done." Many in the courtroom could not hold back their emotions, not because of the words themselves, but because of how casually they were spoken, as if it were a habit, a matter of course in a system everyone believed was still working fine. The defense lawyer tried to dismiss Emily's testimony, claiming she was too young, that her memory was unreliable, and that personal emotions had skewed her perception. But every question, every attempt to trap her, was met with rare calmness. She not only remembered every word, but could describe the position of equipment, the lighting in the room, the time each officer entered and exited, and even their badge numbers. No one could doubt the truth of her account. After Emily's testimony, the prosecutors continued to present footage of Jordan being assaulted, along with his testimony about being threatened and nearly assassinated. Meanwhile, bank account records, internal emails, and minutes from a confidential meeting between Kensington and Callahan were revealed, exposing the truth. This city had been run like a protection racket, where the people were customers forced to pay, and the justice system was a tool of intimidation rather than protection. At the end of the 10th day of trial, the judge declared a recess so the jury could begin deliberating the preliminary verdict. Outside the courthouse, thousands of people continued to gather every day, all eager not to miss the moment when justice, once buried under the concrete of power, would be unearthed and placed back where it belonged. In the witness waiting room, Emily sat beside her father, her small but strong hands holding the steaming cup of tea. Malcolm looked at his daughter, his eyes quietly filled with pride. Without saying a word, they both understood that this trial was not just a punishment for the guilty, but a clear declaration. A new generation had risen, not only to expose the darkness, but to reignite the flame of justice, once and for all. After nearly 3 weeks of continuous hearings, with dozens of public debates, testimonies from over 30 witnesses, and irrefutable evidence displayed before the entire nation, the day of the final verdict finally arrived. The federal court was packed that day. Thousands of citizens stood outside, eyes glued to the large screen broadcasting live from inside the courtroom. In the tense silence, Federal Judge Rebecca Monroe, who was appointed to preside over the case, slowly walked in, her gaze sweeping over each of the defendants: Callahan, Kensington, and Whitaker, once figures who graced the red carpets of power, now sitting in prison jumpsuits, as silent as forgotten stone statues. After reiterating the trial process, the testimony of witnesses, and the undeniable value of the physical evidence, Judge Monroe delivered the verdict in a clear, resounding voice that filled the courtroom. Robert Callahan, James Kensington, and William Whitaker, you have betrayed the public's trust, turning the justice system into a tool for oppression, exploitation, and the manipulation of power. This is not only a personal wrongdoing, but a grievous offense against the Constitution and the foundational values of our democratic society. As she paused, all eyes turned to the bench, where the breath of life waited, silent and still, ready to take its first breath after years of suffocation. Then the sentence was announced. Robert Callahan, 32 years in prison without parole, for crimes including abuse of power, evidence fabrication, racketeering, witness intimidation, and systematic violence under the guise of law. James Kensington, 28 years in prison, convicted of money laundering, bribery, abuse of office, conspiracy to obstruct investigations, and numerous financial crimes related to embezzling public assets. William Whitaker, 35 years in prison, with charges of judicial manipulation, bribery, overturning wrongful convictions, and covering up evidence in over 20 cases. Accompanying the sentences was an order to seize all ill-gotten assets from foreign accounts, shell companies, real estate, and covert investment funds that the three defendants had used to hide their illegal profits. And it did not stop with these three names. Thanks to the clues traced from bank records and Lisa Carter's audio diaries, dozens of other officials, from department heads to district court clerks and senior officers, were also indicted. A network once thought invulnerable was now being dismantled, link by link, before the eyes of the nation. In the week following the trial, the Department of Justice announced a plan to return the stolen assets to the community. At a press conference held outside the city government building, Malcolm Davis, in his role as Attorney General, spoke on behalf of the entire justice system, committing, "Every dollar that was stolen from the people will be returned to where it belongs: schools, hospitals, public facilities, family support programs, and communities that were harmed by the corruption of power." A criminal justice reform fund named the Carter and Davis Fund was officially established, largely funded by the confiscated assets of Callahan, Kensington, and Whitaker. The fund's mission was to invest in legal education programs for youth, support victims of wrongful convictions, and finance independent groups that monitor the law enforcement system. Schools that had their budgets slashed under Kensington's tenure were now expanded again. Abandoned playgrounds were revived into community parks. Free courses on civil rights, police interaction skills, and basic law were introduced in high schools. Even Precinct 18, once a symbol of abuse and violence, was restructured into a community justice center, hosting workshops, legal consultations, and offering support to the public. At a modest, yet moving ceremony held at that very center, Emily Davis was invited to speak. She stepped up to the small stage, no notes in hand, only a calm smile and a determined gaze. The gaze of someone who had walked through darkness. "I'm not the only victim, but I was fortunate enough to survive to tell the story. What I do is not to become a symbol, but to remind us all that the system does not change without people daring to ask questions, to observe, and to speak the truth. Silence is what people like Callahan, Kensington, and Whitaker relied on. But now, we will no longer be silent." Emily's speech was broadcast nationwide. The 17-year-old girl who had been humiliated, handcuffed in front of those too afraid to look, now stood in the light of justice, not as a witness but as a beacon guiding the way. The truth had been revealed. Justice had been served. And for the first time in many years, the people of the city no longer felt that the law was a game they weren't invited to play. Instead, they began to believe that, even if slow and arduous, justice could still find its way home. After the historic verdict and the rebirth of public trust, no one wanted to return to the old ways. A system where silence was rewarded and conscience punished. The events that took place at Precinct 18 left a deep wound in the community, but it was from that wound that a rare opportunity for rebirth began to take shape. No one wanted to lose this moment. No one wanted to repeat history again. On the cold tiles of the building that once housed Precinct 18, where screams, the slamming of metal doors, and shady interrogations behind closed doors once echoed, now the sound of children laughing. whiteboards being marked, and the warm voice of a teacher filled the air every morning. The building was no longer a police station. It had been completely transformed into the Eleanor Community Justice Center, named after Emily Davis's late grandmother, a former teacher who had inspired generations to rise against injustice, and also a silent symbol in her granddaughter's heart as she walked into the historic trial. Here, the public could take free classes on citizenship rights, learn about legal procedures, receive basic legal counseling, and discover how to respond safely and effectively in interactions with public authorities. The center also offered training on recognizing and preventing unconscious racial bias, an essential part of healing the wounds left by the old system. Alongside the classes were community dialogues, where residents from all walks of life, children, the elderly, business people, students, former police officers, were invited to sit together, share experiences, challenge biases, and rebuild trust. The new local police officers, selected for their ethical standards and thoroughly retrained, were present not to oversee, but to listen. For the first time in many years, the public felt they no longer had to choose between safety and dignity. From the success at Precinct 18, the wave of reform quickly spread. With political support from the Department of Justice and an unprecedented public outcry, the city launched a comprehensive police reform program known as the Trust Restoration Initiative. Key highlights of the policy included: all police units were required to wear and maintain body cameras with independent storage systems and third-party oversight. The establishment of a community oversight committee, including lawyers, journalists, social activists, and community representatives, with access to investigative records and the ability to intervene in cases of misconduct. Comprehensive retraining of law enforcement on nonviolent responses, interactions. With multicultural communities and emotional control during duties. Periodic ethical evaluations, where each officer received anonymous feedback from the citizens they served. Additionally, a community transparency index was implemented. All enforcement actions, internal complaints, and investigation results were publicly disclosed on a quarterly basis, allowing citizens to monitor and oversee the activities of the security forces. The black boxes, once prevalent in government agencies, were now being peeled away, illuminated by data and courage. Malcolm Davis, though still serving as Attorney General, chose not to appear regularly in front of the cameras. He let the voices guiding the reforms be those who had been hurt, like Jordan Carter, who had become an independent investigative journalist, or Lisa Carter, now heading the Internal Integrity Agency, an organization set up to investigate misconduct within the executive branch. Emily Davis, though only 17, had become a national symbol of justice and civic strength. She continued her studies at the local high school, rejecting all offers for promotional branding or media appearances. "I'm still a student," she said during a seminar at the Eleanor Center. "But I understand that sometimes the people most underestimated can see the truth most clearly." In one of the citizenship classes at the new center, an 8th grader asked Emily during a Q&A session, "Were you scared standing up to testify against those in power?" She smiled softly, her gaze unwavering. "Yes, but being scared doesn't mean backing down. Fear is a sign that it matters." Change has never been easy, and the remnants of the old system still linger. In the mentality, the hesitance, and the doubts yet to be erased. But with each class, each dialogue session, each transparency report made public, trust was being rebuilt, not with promises but with consistent, tangible, and persistent actions. Precinct 18 used to be a place people feared to enter. Now, it was the first place they turned to when they wanted to change something for the community. And that the silent yet steady transformation in the hearts of the people, was the strongest proof that justice is not only enforced through verdicts, but also through the way a society chooses to rebuild itself from the ashes. Building on the spirit of reform awakened from the ashes of a system once rotten to the core. Those who once bravely stepped out of the shadows to stand witness for justice now continue to become the creators of the future. No one remembers Lisa Carter simply as a detective or Jordan Carter as a teenager holding a phone in the middle of a supermarket. They have become symbols of determination. And now, both of them step into new roles, larger, deeper, and with a reach far beyond the limits of a city once controlled by fear and silence. Lisa Carter, after the historic trials, received a direct invitation from the Federal Department of Justice to lead an entirely new organization, the National Police Integrity Bureau, a specialized, independent unit tasked with overseeing law enforcement agencies across the country, investigating signs of misconduct, and proposing reform measures at the local level. The central office is based in Washington, D.C., but Lisa spends most of her time traveling across states, places where the people still lack the words to name the injustice they endure. She appears at training sessions in small towns, listening to the stories of low-ranking officers and rural citizens who have lost faith in the law. Not lecturing, not giving speeches, Lisa chooses to engage in honest conversations, sharing vivid examples from her own story, about the years she stayed silent out of fear and the moment she turned her back on her colleagues when she realized silence was complicity. One of Lisa's first successes at her new agency was the establishment of the White Witness Program, a program where honest officers can report the misconduct of their colleagues without fear of retaliation or being ostracized. Thanks to this program, numerous cases were uncovered in units that seemed clean, but were actually harboring a culture of cover-ups and internal violence. The discussion sessions Lisa led, broadcasted live on social media platforms, garnered millions of viewers, not for her sharp voice or grandiose rhetoric, but because each story she told was real, painful, and awakening. Meanwhile, Jordan Carter, the one who once trembled while holding the camera as Emily was wrongfully arrested, has now grown into a widely influential investigative journalist. With a scholarship from the Carter and Davis Foundation, Jordan attended one of the nation's top journalism schools, but instead of staying in the lecture halls, he quickly returned to the field, armed with one determination: to tell the stories of those who have never been heard. The independent newspaper The Undercurrent, founded by Jordan, specializes in in-depth investigative series on racism, police misconduct, and systemic injustice in marginalized communities. His articles are not sensationalized, nor do they embellish the pain. They are sharp, precise, and full of real human stories. Mothers who lost children to police violence, families evicted due to wrongful policies, students pushed out of educational opportunities simply because of where they came from. One of Jordan's most notable series was titled The Voices Never Heard, about wrongful convictions buried in poor counties of the American South. The series not only sparked a movement to reinvestigate over 120 cases of questionable closures, but also became a resource in congressional hearings on criminal justice reform. What sets Jordan apart is not just his writing talent, but his experience. He understands the feeling of being cornered, knows the coldness of handcuffs on his wrists, and recognizes the look in the eyes of those in power who try to deny the humanity of a young black man. It's this experience that gives his writing a weight that is utterly genuine, not a charge, but a testimony. Both Lisa and Jordan, each in their own place, with their own approach, are two pillars supporting the spirit of reform that is spreading across the country. At an annual conference on Homeland Security policy, for the first time, they both appeared on stage. When asked what the most important factor in changing a system that had rotted from within was, Lisa answered with a simple sentence. "It's not considering silence as an option." Jordan nodded, adding, "And it's never stopping from telling the truth, telling it until they are forced to listen." In the spotlight, two people who were once the targets of the system are now the ones rebuilding it, with words, actions, and an integrity that cannot be bought with titles or money. And with every step they take, a part of America is gradually healed. Not by powerful blows, but by every story told the right way, every witness willing to stand up, and every brick placed properly to replace the walls that had collapsed. Continuing the steady steps of Lisa Carter and Jordan Carter, the spirit of reform was no longer confined to the old walls of Precinct 18, or the boundaries of a city once a symbol of corruption. From the case of Emily Davis, the flame of justice ignited, crossing local borders and spreading like an unstoppable tide, awakening the once silent communities, the towns that had bowed their heads, and even the places where the shadow of power had concealed the truth for decades. The name Emily Davis became a national symbol, not just because she was the daughter of the Attorney General, but because her story reflected systemic injustice, when a young black girl was publicly handcuffed in a supermarket simply because her presence made others feel out of place. And from that very moment, a movement began, not with slogans but with actions, meticulous, steadfast, and deeply rooted in the social structure. States from the South like Georgia, Mississippi, and industrial regions in the North like Ohio and Michigan began establishing independent investigative committees to probe misconduct in the justice system and police force. This model was directly based on the proposals in the Restoring Trust initiative that Malcolm Davis had put forward. These committees had access to internal records, the power to subpoena witnesses, and the ability to conduct investigations without needing approval from local police leadership, an unprecedented step in the history of modern American law. Over 200 cases that had been dismissed, concealed, or suppressed, mostly related to police violence, wrongful convictions, and racial discrimination, were reopened under the pressure of the public and media. Notably, the case of Daniel Montoya in Texas, a Latino worker wrongfully convicted for nearly 12 years due to coerced testimony, was reopened thanks to the transparency model and witness protection system implemented after Emily's case. In a moving retrial, the judge declared before the press cameras, "Justice is not a verdict, but a journey that must never stop." In Chicago, a widespread investigation into the police union fund revealed millions of dollars being used to pay legal fees for officers accused of misconduct rather than improving service conditions. Public outrage led to the restructuring of the entire governing board involved and the passage of a new federal law, the Internal Legal Accountability Act, which clearly stated that public funds could not be used to cover up misconduct. At the same time, nonprofit organizations and universities launched new training programs called Emily's Watch, a nationwide initiative aimed at training students, activists, and young citizens on how to gather legally sound evidence, protect data, and communicate safely in emergency situations involving abuse of power. In less than a year, over 75,000 people nationwide had registered for the courses, creating a network of witnesses equipped with legal knowledge, a living barrier against systematic abuse. The reform movement also made a strong impact on local election campaigns. Candidates once seen as too radical for calling for the defunding of militarized police or dismantling the impervious officer role now won resounding victories in many states thanks to support from the younger generation. Major cities like Los Angeles, Philadelphia, and Atlanta began piloting community response units to replace police in unarmed situations, such as mental health care, domestic conflict resolution, and non-criminal conflict mediation. Preliminary results showed a significant decrease in violent incidents and a notable increase in trust in public institutions in communities that had been historically underserved. And then, when the first year after Emily Davis's case passed, Jordan Carter's The Undercurrent published a special piece titled, "1 Year Later, No One is Small When the Truth Stands Beside Them." The article quoted Emily in a private meeting with young people who had witnessed misconduct but had never spoken out. "I am not special. I only had an opportunity that many others didn't to survive and tell the story. But if my voice can pave the way for others to speak up, I will never stop." Emily's story transcended personal or city borders, becoming part of collective memory and a driving force for real change in the real world, where every law, every report, and every hearing began to ask the question, who do we protect, and who do we really serve? And in that moment, America, though still cracked, still in battles yet undecided, took its first steps toward a justice system that was no longer a slogan, but action, responsibility, and a promise kept with blood, tears, and the wisdom of those brave enough to rise from the worst of it. Following the wave of reforms that spread across the country, the name of Emily Davis was no longer just tied to a wrongful arrest or a historic trial. Her story transcended the confines of a legal event. It became a symbol, a profound reminder that justice does not necessarily have to start from positions of power, but can take root from a steadfast heart amidst countless silences. Emily was seen as a young symbol of the new era, a generation that refuses to surrender, does not accept injustice as a given, and dares to speak out even when facing a colossal system. Not everyone can clearly see the moment when an individual becomes a living legacy. But for Emily Davis, it happened naturally, like a seed silently sprouting after a storm. The 17-year-old girl, once handcuffed in a supermarket simply because of her skin color and inappropriate presence, was now featured on school walls as part of civic education programs, on the covers of books on ethics and human rights, and even at international justice reform seminars. However, Emily did not choose to become famous or chase the glory that came from the event that changed her life. On the contrary, she quietly withdrew from the media, returning to high school like any other student, carrying a backpack, taking exams, and worrying about final tests as if the world had never called her name. But the most obvious difference was in the eyes of those around her, a respect not based on fame, but on the belief that in this young girl there was something unshakable. Her classmates turned to Emily for advice when they faced unfair treatment by teachers or discrimination based on their background or family circumstances. She listened, never judged, never gave grand speeches, but simply nodded and asked, "Are you ready to speak up? If you are, I will stand by you." And from those words, new voices were stirred, new actions began, and a generation of students no longer saw silence as the only choice. Emily's story was taught in many schools as part of the Modern Citizenship and Ethics program. Students not only learned about her as a historical figure, but were also encouraged to think, what would you do in that situation? A question that seemed simple but opened the hearts of young people to the belief that strength does not lie in age, status, or appearance, but in the choice not to turn away from what is wrong. Years after the event, at Emily's high school graduation ceremony, the principal dedicated a long section of his speech to talk about the right to question. And when Emily walked up to the stage to receive her diploma, the entire auditorium stood and applauded. Not because she was the daughter of the Attorney General, but because she was a living testament to a simple truth. No one is too small to make a difference. Then, during a private conversation at a large civil rights conference, a young reporter asked Emily the final question. "What kept you from giving up during all that time?" She smiled, her gaze as warm as it had been when she was 17. Because I once sat in a cold jail cell, despised, seen as a name that needed to be erased from the record. But I knew, if I stayed silent, how many others would have their mouths shut like mine. I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who believes that when the truth is spoken, it can't be swallowed. And it was that belief that wrote the legacy of Emily Davis. It wasn't a legacy built by monuments or grand ceremonies, but by the hallways of schools where students discussed justice as something real, by young police officers bowing their heads in gratitude for being taught again about professional ethics, by working-class families who could trust that the law would not turn its back on them when they needed it most. Emily proved that sometimes just one action taken at the right moment can shake an entire system. And in a world where indifference had once been a silent epidemic, Emily Davis was the antidote. Small but powerful enough to awaken a nation. She wasn't just the spark for a revolution in justice and equality. She was also a living reminder that anyone, no matter how young or seemingly powerless, can be a hero if they dare to confront what is wrong and stand on the side of what is right. The story of Emily Davis was not just a case of exoneration or a system reform. It was a powerful testimony to the truth that sometimes those who are most overlooked can change the most. A young black girl, wrongfully arrested simply because her presence made others uncomfortable, courageously stood up, observed, remembered, and brought an entire network of corruption into the light. She had no weapons but her intellect, courage, and unshakable belief in justice. And the question we all must ask ourselves is, if you were Emily in that story, would you be willing to speak up? Or would you choose silence? If this story inspires you, share the video so more people can learn about the power of truth, and subscribe to the channel to continue joining us on future journeys of justice. Because who knows, the next story might be yours.